when three teenage bullies decided to humiliate their school nurse with an elaborate prank. They had no idea they were targeting a decorated army combat medic who had saved lives under enemy fire in Afghanistan. What happened next would become the most talked about incident in Oakwood High School's history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell arrived at Oakwood High School every morning at exactly 7:15, 30 minutes before the first bell rang. At 34, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that most people mistook for simple professionalism. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she wore scrubs that were practical rather than fashionable. To the students and faculty of this suburban Pennsylvania school, she was simply Mrs. Mitchell, the school nurse who took their temperatures, bandaged their cuts, and called their parents when they claimed to have mysterious stomach aches during math tests. What they didn't know was that Sarah had spent the last 12 years of her life in a completely different world. Before trading her military fatigues for medical scrubs, Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell had been one of the Army's most decorated combat medics, serving 3 tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division. She had performed emergency surgery in bombed-out buildings while mortar shells exploded overhead. She had carried wounded soldiers through hostile territory under cover of darkness. She had looked death in the eye more times than she cared to count and had never once backed down. But those days felt like a lifetime ago now. After her final deployment, Sarah had made a conscious decision to leave that world behind. The transition to civilian life hadn't been easy. The nightmares still came sometimes, and loud noises could still make her heart race. But working with teenagers, helping them with their everyday problems, felt like a kind of healing. These kids with their scraped knees and headaches represented everything she had fought to protect overseas. Their innocence, their future, their right to grow up in safety. Sarah had moved to Millbrook specifically because it was the opposite of everything she'd known in the military. This quiet suburban community, with its tree-lined streets and well-funded schools, represented the American dream she'd defended. The biggest crisis here was usually a student fainting during a blood drive, or someone having an allergic reaction to cafeteria food. It was exactly the kind of peaceful environment she'd hoped to find. The health office at Oakwood High had become her sanctuary. She'd organized every supply cabinet with military precision, keeping medications locked and accounted for, maintaining detailed records of every student interaction. The walls were decorated with cheerful health posters about nutrition and exercise, but hidden behind her desk was a small framed photo of her old unit, the only visible reminder of her previous life. Her daily routine was comforting in its predictability. Check supplies, review student health records, prepare for the morning rush of students who would invariably claim various ailments to avoid first period classes. By 8 o'clock, she'd usually seen her first fake stomachache of the day, administered a few band-aids, and taken at least one temperature that would mysteriously return to normal once a parent was called. The students at Oakwood generally liked Mrs. Mitchell. She was kind, but not a pushover, understanding, but not gullible. She'd mastered the art of distinguishing between genuine illness and teenage dramatics, though she always erred on the side of compassion. The younger students especially appreciated her gentle manner when they were genuinely hurt or scared. But not everyone at Oakwood High appreciated Sarah's presence. Tyler Brooks had made that clear from almost the moment she'd started working there 6 months ago. Tyler was 17, stood 6 feet tall, and had the kind of natural charisma that made other students gravitate toward him. He was handsome in that effortless way that teenage girls found irresistible, with sandy brown hair that always looked perfectly tousled, and green eyes that sparkled with mischief. What made Tyler particularly dangerous wasn't his size or his looks, but his intelligence. He was smart enough to maintain a B+ average without trying, charming enough to talk his way out of most trouble, and calculating enough to know exactly how far he could push before facing real consequences. His father was a prominent local attorney who had made substantial donations to the school district, which seemed to grant Tyler a certain immunity from the usual rules that governed other students. Tyler's two closest friends, Mason Carter and Ethan Rodriguez, formed a tight-knit group that had terrorized various targets throughout their high school careers. Mason was the muscle of the operation, built like a linebacker with arms that strained, against his shirt sleeves and a quick temper that Tyler had learned to weaponize. Ethan was the tech specialist, always carrying the latest smartphone and seemingly able to hack into any system or social media platform they needed for their schemes. Together, they'd perfected the art of making other people's lives miserable, while maintaining their own reputations as popular, well-connected students. They were too smart to get caught with anything that would result in serious punishment, but ruthless enough to destroy someone's social standing or emotional well-being. If they decided that person deserved their attention. Sarah had first encountered Tyler during her second week at Oakwood High. He'd come to the health office, claiming to have injured his shoulder during football practice, but something about his demeanor had immediately put her on alert. Maybe it was the way his eyes had swept the room, cataloging every detail, or the fact that his supposed injury disappeared the moment she'd suggested calling his parents to discuss an X-ray. Since then, Tyler had made it his mission to test the new school nurse. He'd sent his friends to the health office with increasingly ridiculous fake symptoms. Mason had once claimed to be allergic to the color blue, while Ethan had insisted he was suffering from homework poisoning. When Sarah had calmly documented these visits and suggested they might benefit from speaking with the school counselor about their apparent health anxieties, Tyler had escalated his efforts. The pranks had started small. Sarah would arrive in the morning to find her office supplies mysteriously rearranged. Medical posters would be defaced with crude drawings that somehow appeared overnight. Her carefully organized medicine cabinet would be just slightly out of order, enough to be noticeable, but not enough to prove deliberate tampering. Sarah had dealt with far worse than teenage pranks, so she'd simply documented each incident and continued with her work. She'd survived mortar attacks and sniper fire. She wasn't about to be intimidated by some spoiled high school students. But her calm response seemed to frustrate Tyler, who was used to getting dramatic reactions from his targets. The harassment had gradually intensified over the past few months. Tyler and his friends would loiter outside the health office, making loud comments about how the army nurse probably couldn't handle civilian medical problems. They'd stage elaborate fake injuries that required Sarah to waste time and supplies, before revealing them as jokes. Once, they'd somehow managed to redirect all the school's prank calls to the health office, forcing Sarah to spend an entire afternoon fielding fake emergency reports. Through it all, Sarah had maintained her professional composure. She'd been trained to stay calm under pressure, to think clearly when lives were on the line. Dealing with Tyler Brooks and his friends was nothing compared to trying to save a soldier's life while under enemy fire. But she'd also been trained to recognize when a situation was escalating towards something more dangerous. Her military instincts told her that Tyler was building towards something bigger. The way he watched her, the way he studied her routines, the increasing boldness of his pranks, all suggested that he was planning some kind of grand finale. Sarah had seen enough combat to recognize the signs of an impending attack, even if this one involved teenagers in a suburban high school rather than enemy combatants in a war zone. The other faculty members at Oakwood High had noticed the tension, but most seemed reluctant to get involved. Tyler's family connections made him essentially untouchable, and several teachers had learned the hard way that crossing him could result in mysterious complaints being filed against them. Principal Janet Walsh was a decent administrator, but seemed overwhelmed by the political complexities of dealing with influential parents. Coach Mike Thompson was one of the few staff members who'd shown any willingness to support Sarah. He'd pulled Tyler aside after witnessing one particularly obvious incident of harassment, but Tyler had simply smiled and claimed he was just being friendly to the new nurse. Without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, there was little anyone could do officially. Sarah appreciated Coach Thompson's concern, but she'd made it clear that she could handle the situation herself. She'd dealt with much worse than Tyler Brooks in Afghanistan, where the stakes had been life and death rather than teenage social dynamics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The discipline that had made her an exceptional combat medic also served her well in civilian life. She would not be intimidated, she would not be driven away, and she would certainly not give Tyler the satisfaction of seeing her react emotionally to his games. But as winter turned to spring and Tyler's pranks grew bolder, Sarah began to realize that her tormentor was planning something that would force her to break her carefully maintained professional facade. The way he'd been studying her schedule, noting when she was alone in the health office, suggested that he was preparing for a confrontation that would be impossible to ignore or deflect. What Tyler Brooks didn't understand was that he wasn't dealing with just another adult authority figure who could be intimidated or embarrassed into submission. He was targeting someone who had spent years in situations where hesitation meant death, where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died. Sarah Mitchell had faced down armed insurgents in the mountains of Afghanistan. She had performed emergency surgery while bullets whizzed overhead. She had carried wounded comrades through hostile territory under cover of darkness. Tyler thought he was planning to humiliate a suburban school nurse. What he was actually doing was preparing to confront a decorated combat veteran who had never lost a battle and had no intention of starting now. The question wasn't whether Sarah could handle whatever Tyler had planned. The question was whether Tyler and his friends were prepared for the consequences of finally pushing too far. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything at Oakwood High School. Tyler Brooks was about to learn that some people's strength runs much deeper than surface appearances suggest, and that the quiet, professional woman he'd been tormenting for months was capable of things he couldn't even imagine. What happened next would become a legend that students would talk about for years to come, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous opponents are the ones who seem the most harmless. The first direct confrontation between Sarah and Tyler occurred on a rainy Thursday morning in late March. Sarah had just finished restocking her medical supplies when Tyler appeared in the doorway of the health office, flanked by Mason and Ethan. Unlike his usual casual visits, this time Tyler knocked politely and waited for permission to enter. "Good morning, Mrs. Mitchell," Tyler said with exaggerated politeness, his voice carrying that particular tone teenagers use when they're planning something. "I was wondering if you could help us with a health project we're working on for Mr. Peterson's biology class." Sarah looked up from her inventory clipboard, immediately noting the subtle signs that put her military training on alert. Tyler's body language was too controlled, too rehearsed. Mason kept glancing toward the hallway, as if watching for witnesses or authority figures. Ethan had positioned himself near the door in a way that would make it difficult for someone to leave quickly. These weren't the movements of students seeking legitimate help. "What kind of project?" Sarah asked, setting down her clipboard but keeping her hands free. Old habits from combat zones died hard, and something about this situation felt like the calm before an attack. "We're supposed to research different medical careers," Tyler continued, stepping further into the small office space. "I thought it would be really interesting to learn about your background. You know, what made you want to become a school nurse?" The question itself wasn't unusual. Sarah had fielded similar inquiries from genuinely curious students before, but Tyler's tone carried an undercurrent that suggested he already knew more about her background than he was letting on. The way Ethan's fingers twitched toward his phone made her suspect this conversation was being recorded. "I've always been interested in helping people," Sarah replied carefully, giving the same generic answer she used whenever students asked about her career path. She'd learned early in her transition to civilian life that most people weren't ready to hear about the realities of combat medicine. "That's so noble," Tyler said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "But I heard from some people that you used to do something else before this, something more exciting." Mason and Ethan exchanged glances, clearly enjoying whatever plan they'd hatched. Sarah realized this wasn't a random encounter. They'd done research, probably digging through social media or public records to uncover details about her military service. The thought of these teenagers treating her past as entertainment material made something cold settle in her chest. "I've had various jobs," Sarah said evenly. "Is there something specific I can help you with, or do you need to get to class?" "Oh, we have plenty of time," Tyler assured her, settling into one of the chairs reserved for students. "See, what's really interesting is that we found some old newspaper articles online about this female soldier who saved like a dozen guys in Afghanistan. Same name as yours, Sarah Mitchell. Crazy coincidence, right?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that would have been recognizable to anyone who'd served in the military. Tyler was too young and too naive to understand what that change meant, but he sensed he'd struck a nerve. "There are probably many Sarah Mitchells in the world," she replied, but her voice had taken on a different quality, flatter, more controlled. The voice she'd used when giving orders under fire. "Maybe," Tyler conceded, pulling out his phone, "but this one has the same hometown listed in her service record. And look at this photo from the newspaper." He held up his screen, showing a grainy image of a younger Sarah in military fatigues, standing next to an army medical transport vehicle. Ethan leaned forward eagerly. "The article says she single-handedly defended a field hospital when it came. Under attack, used a rifle while performing surgery. That's like something out of a movie. And then there's this commendation," Mason added, reading from his own phone, "for extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy fire. Treated and evacuated 17 wounded soldiers while under sustained attack." Sarah's hands remained perfectly still on her desk, but her eyes had taken on a quality that would have made her old commanding officer proud. She was assessing threats, calculating responses, running through options with the speed and precision that had kept her alive in combat zones. "I think you boys should head to class now," she said quietly. "But we're just getting started," Tyler protested, his confidence growing as he mistook her stillness for intimidation. "I mean, if you really are this war hero, why are you working as a school nurse? Seems like kind of a waste of talent." "Unless maybe the stories are exaggerated," Ethan suggested with mock innocence. "You know how military people like to make themselves sound tougher than they really are." That was the moment Sarah's carefully maintained professional mask slipped just slightly. For just an instant, these teenage boys glimpsed something that made Mason unconsciously step backward toward the door. It was the look of someone who'd seen things they couldn't imagine, done things they couldn't comprehend, survived situations that would have broken most people. "Class, now." Sarah's voice cut through the air like a blade. There was no anger in it, no emotion at all. It was simply a command, delivered by someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Tyler felt something primitive and instinctual, telling him to comply immediately, but his teenage bravado overrode his survival instincts. Wow, touchy subject. Maybe those newspaper reports were wrong after all. The real war hero probably wouldn't get so defensive about Tyler. The single word carried enough authority to stop him mid-sentence. Sarah had risen from her chair, and though she was several inches shorter than the teenage boy, something about her presence filled the room. You have exactly 10 seconds to remove yourself from my office. For a moment, the three boys stood frozen. They'd expected to rattle the quiet school nurse, maybe get some embarrassing reaction they could record and share. Instead, they'd awakened something that made their primitive brains scream warnings about predators and danger. Tyler recovered first, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Relax, Mrs. Mitchell. We were just asking questions. No need to get all drill sergeant on us." 5 seconds, Sarah said calmly. This time, survival instincts won. The three boys filed out of the health office with considerably less swagger than they'd entered. But Tyler paused at the doorway, his wounded pride demanding he have the last word. "You know, for someone who's supposed to be some kind of war hero, you sure seem scared of a few high school students asking questions," he said, trying to regain some of his lost bravado. Sarah met his gaze directly, and Tyler felt something. Cold crawl up his spine. "I'm not scared of you, Tyler. I'm protecting you from me." The words were spoken so quietly that Tyler almost wondered if he'd imagined them, but something in Sarah's eyes made it clear she meant every syllable. He managed to hold her stare for exactly 3 seconds before looking away and hurrying to catch up with his friends. As the boys disappeared down the hallway, Sarah sank back into her chair and took a slow, measured breath. She'd maintained control, but just barely. The careful equilibrium she'd built over the past 6 months had been shattered in the span. Of a 5-minute conversation, the memories Tyler's questions had stirred up weren't ones she welcomed. The newspaper articles he'd found barely scratched the surface of what had actually happened during that attack on Forward Operating Base Titan. The reporters had focused on the heroic narrative, the female soldier who'd saved lives under fire. They hadn't written about the nightmares that followed, the weight of decisions made in split seconds, the faces of the soldiers she hadn't been able to save. Sarah had come to Millbrook specifically to escape those memories, to find peace in a job where the biggest crisis was a teenager with a headache or a scraped knee. She'd thought she'd successfully buried Staff Sergeant Mitchell, but Tyler Brooks had just dug her up and dragged her back into the light. The rest of that day passed in a haze of normal school nurse duties, but Sarah found herself hyper-aware of every sound in the hallway, every shadow that passed by her door. Her old combat instincts were fully awake now, scanning for threats and planning defensive positions. She knew from experience that Tyler wouldn't let this go. He'd sensed weakness, or what he thought was weakness, and predators always pressed their advantages. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment staring at the framed photo she kept on her nightstand. It showed her with her medical unit just weeks before the attack that had made her famous. Young faces full of optimism and camaraderie, most of them unaware that half their number would be coming home in caskets or with life-changing injuries. She kept in touch with the survivors over the years, but those connections had grown strained as civilian life pulled them in different directions. Most of them understood why she'd left the military and respected her decision to start fresh. But a few had questioned whether she was running away from her responsibilities, abandoning the skills that had made her exceptional. Sarah picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Staff Sergeant David Morrison, known to everyone in their unit as Tank, had been her closest friend and fiercest protector during their deployments. He'd stayed in the Army, making it his career, and they'd maintained sporadic contact over the years. The phone rang twice before Tank's familiar voice answered. "Well, I'll be damned. Sarah Mitchell. How's civilian life treating you?" "It's complicated," Sarah admitted, feeling some of the tension leave her shoulders just from hearing a friendly voice that understood her background. Complicated how? Some small-town drama getting to you? Sarah found herself smiling despite her stress. Tank had always been able to read her moods, even over the phone. Something like that. I've got some local troublemakers who've been testing boundaries. Today they decided to bring up the past. Tank's voice grew more serious. Someone's been digging into your service record? High school students. They found some old newspaper articles and thought they'd have some fun with them. High school students? Tank's laugh was incredulous. Sarah, you do realize you could probably take on their entire football team with one hand tied behind your back. That's not the point, Sarah said quickly. I'm trying to be a normal civilian here. I can't just intimidate teenagers because they're being obnoxious. No, but you can't let them think you're weak either. Kids like that, they smell fear and they attack. You taught me that yourself, remember? Back when we had to deal with those local militants who kept testing our perimeter. Sarah did remember. It had been during her second deployment, when their base had been dealing with increasingly bold, probing attacks from local insurgents. Sarah had been the one to point out that showing restraint was being interpreted as weakness, and that sometimes a strong response was the only way to prevent escalation. This is different, she insisted. These are just kids. Kids who are pushing a decorated combat veteran for fun, Tank pointed out. Sarah, I know you want to leave the war behind, but some lessons from over there apply everywhere. You can't let people think you're an easy target. I'm handling it. By retreating, by hoping they'll get bored and move on. Tank's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been through multiple combat deployments. That's not the Sarah Mitchell I served with. The Sarah I knew would have shut this down before it got started. After they hung up, Sarah sat in the darkness of her apartment thinking about Tank's words. Maybe he was right. Maybe her desire to blend in and avoid conflict had sent the wrong message. In Afghanistan, she'd learned that sometimes the only way to prevent violence was to demonstrate strength early and decisively. But this was different. These were American teenagers in a safe suburban school, not enemy combatants in a war zone. The rules were different here. The stakes were different, weren't they? As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would document Tyler's behavior more thoroughly. She would speak with Principal Walsh about establishing clearer boundaries. She would handle this situation through proper civilian channels, the way a school nurse should. What she didn't know was that Tyler Brooks had already moved far beyond the kind of behavior that could be handled through normal disciplinary channels. While Sarah was trying to convince herself that this was just teenage mischief that would blow over, Tyler was planning something that would force her to choose between her desire for a peaceful civilian life and the warrior instincts that had kept her alive in combat. The next morning brought the kind of crisp spring day that made everyone at Oakwood High eager for summer vacation. Sarah arrived at her usual time, determined to treat this as just another normal day. She'd resolved to maintain her professional demeanor regardless of what Tyler might try next. But as she unlocked the health office door, she immediately knew something was wrong. Her desk had been moved slightly, just enough to be noticeable to someone with her attention to detail. Her supply cabinets showed similar signs of subtle disturbance. Someone had been in her office overnight. Sarah's first instinct was to call security, but she forced herself to think rationally. Nothing appeared to be missing or damaged. Whoever had been here had been careful not to leave obvious evidence of their presence. But they'd wanted her to know they'd been there. It was a message, a demonstration that her sanctuary wasn't as secure as she'd believed. As she checked her supplies and equipment, looking for anything that might have been tampered with, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message contained a single photo, a grainy image of her sleeping apartment, taken through her bedroom window. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Tyler and his friends hadn't just invaded her professional space. They'd violated her personal sanctuary as well. They'd escalated from school pranks to what could legally be considered stalking and breaking and entering. Sarah's hands shook slightly as she deleted the message, but not from fear. The tremor was from the effort of controlling the rage that threatened to overwhelm her careful civilian facade. These weren't just obnoxious teenagers anymore. They'd crossed lines that activated every protective instinct she'd developed during years of military service. For the first time since starting work at Oakwood High, Sarah locked her office door from the inside and pulled out her phone to make a call she'd hoped never to make. The number belonged to her old commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes, who now worked in military intelligence. "Colonel, it's Sarah Mitchell. I need a favor." Colonel Patricia Hayes answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the same crisp authority Sarah remembered from their deployments together. "Sarah Mitchell, I was wondering when I'd hear from you again. How's the civilian world treating you?" "Not as peacefully as I'd hoped," Sarah replied, keeping her voice low despite her locked office door. "I need some information, Patricia. Unofficial channels." "What kind of information?" The colonel's tone shifted immediately to business mode. She'd worked with Sarah long enough to know that requests like this weren't made lightly. Background, checks on some local individuals. 3 high school students who've escalated beyond normal teenage behavior. I need to know if there's anything in their families' backgrounds that might explain their confidence in avoiding consequences. Colonel Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, you know I can't run official background checks on American citizens without proper justification. But if you're asking as a friend who's concerned about potential threats, I might be able to point you toward publicly available information." "That's all I'm asking for," Sarah said, providing Tyler's, Mason's, and Ethan's full names along with their parents' information. "Give me 24 hours, Colonel Hayes said. "And Sarah, if these kids are making you consider reaching out to military contacts, they've probably crossed some serious lines. Be careful." After ending the call, Sarah spent the rest of the morning dealing with the usual stream of students seeking excuses to miss class. But her professional autopilot was running while her mind processed the escalation of Tyler's campaign against her. The photograph of her apartment had been a declaration of war, whether Tyler realized it or not. During her lunch break, Sarah walked through the school's hallways with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting reconnaissance. She noted security camera locations, identified blind spots, and mapped the routes Tyler and his friends typically used between classes. Old habits from securing perimeters in hostile territory translated surprisingly well to a suburban high school environment. As she passed the main office, Principal Janet Walsh called out to her, "Sarah, do you have a minute? I wanted to check in about how things are going." Principal Walsh was a well-meaning administrator in her late 40s, who'd spent her entire career in education. She genuinely cared about both students and staff, but she operated in a world of policy manuals and proper procedures that sometimes seemed inadequate for dealing with real-world problems. "Everything's fine," Sarah replied automatically. Then reconsidered. "Actually, I did want to discuss some concerns about student behavior." They settled into Walsh's office, where motivational posters about education and achievement covered the walls. Sarah chose her words carefully, describing Tyler's harassment without mentioning the photograph or her military background. She focused on documented incidents, the fake medical emergencies, the disrupted supplies, the inappropriate questions about her personal history. "I understand your frustration," Principal Walsh said when Sarah finished. "Tyler Brooks can be challenging, but his academic performance is excellent, and his father contributes significantly to our athletic programs. Mr. Brooks Sr. has made it clear that he expects his son to be treated fairly." What exactly does treated fairly mean? Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Well, Tyler's father is concerned that some staff members might harbor prejudices against successful students. He's asked that any disciplinary actions involving his son be thoroughly documented and reviewed at the district level. Sarah translated this bureaucratic language easily. Tyler's father had essentially purchased immunity for his son through strategic donations and legal intimidation. Any staff member who caused problems for Tyler could expect to face administrative scrutiny and potential career consequences. I see, Sarah said. And what would you recommend if Tyler's behavior continues to escalate? Document everything, Principal Walsh advised. Follow proper channels. And remember that sometimes the best approach with challenging students is to avoid giving them the reaction they're seeking. As Sarah left the principal's office, she reflected grimly on how similar this advice was to the rules of engagement they'd followed in Afghanistan when dealing with hostile locals who couldn't be directly confronted due to political considerations. The parallel was depressingly exact, an identified threat that couldn't be addressed through normal channels due to external political pressures. That afternoon brought the kind of incident that made Sarah realize Tyler's campaign was entering a new phase. She was treating a genuine injury, a sophomore who'd twisted her ankle in gym class, when Tyler appeared in her doorway with Mason and Ethan flanking him. "Knock, knock," Tyler said cheerfully, ignoring the fact that Sarah was clearly busy with a patient. "Hope we're not interrupting anything important." "I'm with a student right now," Sarah replied firmly. "Please wait outside." "Oh, we don't mind waiting," Tyler said, settling into one of the chairs. "It's educational, watching a real medical professional at work." The injured sophomore, Jessica Park, looked uncomfortable with the boy's presence. Sarah could see the girl's anxiety level rising as Tyler and his friends made themselves at home in the small space. "The hallway," Sarah said more forcefully. "Now." "Why so hostile?" Tyler asked with exaggerated hurt. "We're just interested in healthcare. Besides, this is a school facility. Don't all students have a right to be here?" It was a challenge designed to put Sarah in an impossible position. If she forced them to leave, Tyler could claim she was being unreasonable and discriminatory. If she allowed them to stay, he would have successfully demonstrated that he could invade her space at will, even when she was treating patients. Sarah made her decision with the swiftness that had saved lives in combat zones. She turned to Jessica and spoke in the kind of authoritative voice that cut through confusion and panic. "Jessica, I need you to go to the main office right now and ask them to call your parents for pickup. Tell them you need to see a doctor about your ankle." "But I thought you said it was just a sprain," Jessica began. "I want a second opinion," Sarah said firmly, helping the girl to her feet. "Use the crutches and go straight to the office." As Jessica hobbled away, leaving Sarah alone with the three boys, Tyler's smile widened. "Wow, that seemed a little dramatic. Poor kid probably thought her ankle was falling off us." "You have 30 seconds to explain why you're here," Sarah said, positioning herself between the boys and her medical supplies. "Then you leave." "Actually, we came to apologize," Tyler said, his tone suggesting anything but remorse. "Mason, he realized that maybe we came on a little strong yesterday. Didn't we, Mason?" Mason, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, mumbled something that might have been an apology. Ethan was busy examining the medical equipment with suspicious interest. "Apology accepted," Sarah said curtly. "Now leave." "But we also wanted to show you something," Tyler continued, pulling out his phone. "We found more stuff about your military service. Really fascinating stuff." The screen showed what appeared to be a military personnel file, complete with Sarah's service record, deployment history, and commendation details. Information that should have been protected and classified. "Where did you get this?" Sarah's Voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, but something in her tone made Mason take an involuntary step backward. "The internet's amazing these days," Ethan said smugly. "You'd be surprised what you can find if you know where to look." "And who to ask," Tyler added meaningfully. "Turns out my dad has some interesting contacts. People who know people, if you know what I mean." Sarah understood exactly what he meant. Tyler's father had used his legal connections to access information that should have been confidential. They weren't just harassing her randomly, they were conducting systematic intelligence gathering. "The really interesting part," Tyler continued, "is this psychological evaluation from after your last deployment. Something about anger management issues and difficulty adjusting to civilian authority structures." Sarah's vision narrowed to a tunnel focused entirely on Tyler's smirking face. The psychological evaluation had been a routine part of her discharge process, conducted to ensure she was ready for civilian life. The fact that Tyler had access to it meant someone with serious clearance had been willing to violate federal privacy laws. "Post-traumatic stress disorder," Mason read from Tyler's phone, "recommended for counseling due to hypervigilant behavior and trust issues." "Makes you wonder if someone like that should be working around children," Ethan added, with false concern. For just a moment, Sarah felt the careful control she'd maintained for months begin to slip. In her mind, she could see exactly how quickly she could disable all three boys. Tyler would go down first with a strike to the solar plexus, followed by a leg sweep. Mason would require more force due to his size, but a properly applied chokehold would drop him in seconds. Ethan would likely run, but if necessary, she could catch him before he reached the door. The entire sequence played out in her mind with the clarity and precision of her military training. She could execute it flawlessly. And these three teenagers, who thought they were untouchable, would learn exactly what a combat veteran was capable of when properly motivated. But that path led only to the destruction of everything she'd worked to build in her civilian life. Instead, Sarah forced herself to take a slow, measured breath and speak with deadly calm. "Get out of my office, right now. And if you ever mention my medical records again, if you ever access confidential information about me again, if you ever set foot in this office again without a legitimate medical emergency, I will make you regret it in ways your teenage brain cannot currently comprehend." The three boys left, but not before Tyler delivered his parting shot. "You know, Mrs. Mitchell, threatening students could be considered a violation of your employment terms, especially for someone with documented anger issues." As their footsteps faded down the hallway, Sarah slumped into her chair and forced herself to regulate her breathing. Tyler had just demonstrated that he had access to resources she hadn't anticipated. His father's legal connections apparently extended into areas that could access classified military records. More importantly, Tyler had revealed his endgame. He wasn't just trying to embarrass or intimidate her. He was building a case to have her fired, using her own psychological evaluation as ammunition. The references to her mental health records suggested he was planning to claim she was unstable and dangerous. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Colonel Hayes. "Found some interesting information about your young friends. Can't discuss over. Text, are you somewhere secure where we can talk?" Sarah locked her office door and called the colonel back. "What did you find?" "Tyler Brooks' father isn't just a local attorney," Colonel Hayes said without preamble. "He's a defense contractor, lawyer who's worked on several classified military projects. He has security clearance and access to databases that most civilians never see. That explains how they got my psychological evaluation. There's more. Mason Carter's uncle is a police detective who's been disciplined twice for excessive force. Ethan Rodriguez's older brother was discharged from the Marines under questionable circumstances. These kids have connections to people who know how to bend rules and avoid accountability. Sarah absorbed this information with growing unease. So they're not just privileged teenagers, they have genuine protection from people with real power. It gets worse, Colonel Hayes continued. I made some discreet inquiries about Mr. Brooks Sr. He's represented several defense contractors in cases involving military personnel who've made waves. His specialty seems to be discrediting veterans who become inconvenient. Meaning if his son decides you're a problem, Daddy has the resources and experience to destroy your reputation and career. And based on the pattern I'm seeing, that's exactly what they're planning. After ending the call, Sarah sat in her locked office, staring at the medical supplies she'd organized so carefully over the past 6 months. Everything she'd built here, the peaceful life she'd tried to create, was under systematic attack by adversaries who had resources she couldn't match through normal civilian channels. The irony wasn't lost on her. In Afghanistan, she'd faced enemies who were trying to kill her, but at least the rules of engagement were clear. Here, she was being destroyed by teenagers who had powerful adults protecting them and fighting back. Would only confirm their narrative that she was unstable and dangerous. Sarah thought about Tank's words from the previous evening, about the lessons from overseas that applied everywhere. In combat zones, she'd learned that sometimes the only way to prevent escalation was to demonstrate strength early and decisively. But she'd also learned that when facing an enemy with superior resources and political protection, direct confrontation was usually suicide. What she needed was intelligence, strategy, and patience. Tyler Brooks thought he was hunting a vulnerable school nurse, but he'd actually picked a fight with someone who'd spent years developing the skills needed to survive asymmetric warfare. Sarah unlocked her desk drawer and pulled out a notebook. If Tyler wanted to escalate this conflict, she would accommodate him. But it would be fought on her terms, using skills he didn't know she possessed. At the top of the first page, she wrote a single word: reconnaissance. Tyler Brooks was about to learn that some prey fights back. Sarah's reconnaissance over the next week revealed disturbing patterns that confirmed her worst suspicions about Tyler and his crew. She documented their movements between classes, noted their associates, and identified their typical gathering spots. What she discovered was a sophisticated operation that went far beyond typical teenage bullying. Tyler had systematically targeted 3 other staff members over the past 2 years, each time forcing them to either transfer to different schools or leave the district entirely. His methods were always the same: psychological pressure, social humiliation, and finally the deployment of his father's legal resources to create formal complaints that made their positions untenable. Mrs. Chen, the former librarian, had been accused of discrimination after refusing to let Tyler's group use the library for unsupervised meetings. Mr. Rodriguez, a substitute teacher, had been reported for inappropriate behavior after he'd confronted Tyler about cheating. Most recently, Coach Williams had been forced to resign after Tyler's father filed a complaint claiming the coach had shown favoritism against his son. The pattern was clear and chilling. Tyler would identify an authority figure who wouldn't bend to his will, systematically provoke them until they reacted, then use that reaction as justification for having them removed. Sarah was just the latest target in a well-practiced campaign, but Sarah had advantages that Tyler's previous victims hadn't possessed. Her military training had taught her to think strategically, to gather intelligence, and to exploit enemy weaknesses. More importantly, she had contacts and resources that extended far beyond what anyone at Oakwood High School could imagine. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in early April. Sarah was preparing to leave for the weekend when Tyler appeared at her office door with an unusual level of confidence. He wasn't accompanied by his usual crew this time, which immediately put Sarah on alert. "Mrs. Mitchell," Tyler said with exaggerated formality, "I wanted to give you a heads up about something, out of professional courtesy." Sarah didn't respond, simply waited for him to continue while keeping her body language neutral. She'd learned to recognize when Tyler was building towards something significant. "My dad's been reviewing your employment file with the school district," Tyler continued, clearly enjoying himself. "Apparently there are some concerns about your psychological fitness for working with children. Something about anger management issues and difficulty with authority." "Is there a point to this conversation?" Sarah asked calmly. "The point is that you're going to be called in for a psychiatric evaluation next week. Standard procedure. When someone's mental health becomes a concern, my dad's already spoken with the superintendent about it." Tyler paused to let this information sink in before delivering his finishing blow. "Of course, if you wanted to save everyone the trouble, you could always submit your resignation. Mental health leave, maybe. No shame in admitting you're not cut out for civilian work." Sarah absorbed this information without visible reaction, but internally she was calculating rapidly. Tyler's father had managed to use his legal connections and her own psychological evaluation to force a psychiatric review. Even if she passed such an evaluation, the process would be humiliating and would permanently damage her reputation within the district. "I'll consider your suggestion," Sarah said evenly. Tyler's smile widened. "Smart choice. You know, I actually respect what you did overseas. But this isn't Afghanistan, and you're not a soldier anymore. You're just another employee who needs to learn her place." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Mrs. Mitchell, that psychological evaluation mentioned something about hypervigilance and paranoid tendencies. Might want to work on that. People are starting to notice how jumpy you get around loud noises." As Tyler walked away, Sarah felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest. He'd just revealed that he knew about her PTSD symptoms, information that could only have come from her confidential medical records. More than that, he was threatening to weaponize her combat trauma against her. Sarah locked her office door and made a phone call that would change everything. "Colonel Hayes, it's Sarah. I need to cash in some favors." "What do you need?" "Information warfare. These kids have escalated to using classified psychological evaluations to attack my employment. Their father has security clearance and is accessing databases he shouldn't be touching." Colonel Hayes was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, if a civilian contractor is illegally accessing military psychological records, that's a federal crime. But proving it would require resources and authority that I don't have." "What about Tank? He mentioned he was working with military intelligence now." "Tank's with the Criminal Investigation Division. If you can provide evidence of illegal database access, he might be able to open an investigation." Sarah spent the weekend gathering evidence. She documented every instance where Tyler had referenced information that could only have come from classified sources. She compiled a timeline showing the systematic nature of his father's interference with school personnel. Most importantly, she reached out to Tyler's previous victims and convinced them to share their stories. Mrs. Chen had kept detailed records of Tyler's harassment, including dates and witnesses. Mr. Rodriguez had saved the threatening voicemails from Tyler's father. Coach Williams had documentation showing how Tyler's father had used privileged information to build his discrimination case. By Sunday evening, Sarah had assembled a comprehensive dossier that painted a clear picture of systematic abuse of legal authority and illegal access to government databases. She sent the complete package to Tank with a simple message: "Time to show these civilians how real professionals operate. Monday morning brought the kind of crisp spring weather that made Oakwood High School look like something from a college brochure. Students were eager for summer vacation, teachers were counting down to semester breaks, and the usual end-of-year energy filled the hallways. Tyler arrived at school with his characteristic swagger, clearly anticipating Sarah's humiliation when she was called for her psychiatric evaluation. He'd spent the weekend bragging to his friends about how he was finally going to get rid of the crazy army nurse who thought she was tough. What Tyler didn't know was that at 7 that morning, federal agents had simultaneously raided his father's law office and their family home, executing search warrants for illegal access to government databases. Mr. Brooks Sr. was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, facing charges that could result in decades in prison. Sarah learned about the raids from Tank, who called her as she was opening her office. "Package delivered," he said simply. "Your problem should be resolved by lunchtime." What exactly happened? Let's just say that when you illegally access classified military records to harass veterans, you get the full attention of people who take national security very seriously. Mr. Brooks and his contacts are looking at federal charges under the Espionage Act. Sarah was treating a student's scraped knee when Tyler burst into her office shortly before noon. His usual confidence had been replaced by barely controlled panic. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes held the wild look of someone whose world had just collapsed. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice cracking with stress. "The FBI arrested my dad this morning. They took all his computers, all his files. They said something about unauthorized database access." Sarah finished applying the bandage to her patient and sent the boy back to class before turning to face Tyler. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked like what he actually was, a scared teenager who'd just realized he was completely out of his depth. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said calmly. "Don't lie to me," Tyler shouted, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking. "This has to be you. You did something. You called someone." "Lower your voice," Sarah said quietly. "This is a medical facility." "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Tyler continued, his voice rising despite her warning. "Some kind of war hero who can just destroy people's lives because they asked a few questions." Sarah stood up slowly, and something in her movement made Tyler take an unconscious step backward. For the first time, he was seeing her without the professional mask she'd worn for months. What he saw was someone who'd survived things he couldn't imagine, who'd made life and death decisions under enemy fire, who'd earned respect through actions rather than inherited privilege. "Tyler," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Sit down. Now." Tyler found himself complying before he'd consciously decided to do so. Something primitive in his brain recognized the voice of a predator and responded accordingly. "For the past 6 months, you've been playing games with someone you thought was weak and vulnerable," Sarah continued, her tone conversational but carrying an undercurrent that made Tyler's hands shake. "You accessed classified military records. You violated federal privacy laws. You harassed a decorated combat veteran using illegally obtained psychological evaluations." She moved closer, and Tyler pressed back into his chair as if trying to disappear. "What you failed to understand is that people like me don't become victims. We eliminate threats. The only question was whether I'd handle this through civilian channels or military ones." "I didn't know," Tyler whispered. "I didn't know you could do this." "You didn't know a lot of things," Sarah agreed. "You didn't know that accessing classified databases is a federal crime. You didn't know that military intelligence takes these violations seriously. You didn't know that combat veterans have contacts and resources that extend far beyond your father's local legal network." Tyler was crying now, tears streaming down. His face, as the full magnitude of his situation became clear. "Can you fix this? Can you make them drop the charges?" Sarah studied him for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant bully who'd tormented her for months, but a teenage boy who'd just learned that actions have consequences. "Tyler, your father is facing federal charges under the Espionage Act. He illegally accessed classified military databases to harass a veteran. Even if I wanted to help you, which I don't, this is completely beyond my influence." "But I'm just 17, Tyler pleaded. "I didn't know it was illegal. I thought it was just research." "You thought using classified psychological evaluations to attack someone's mental health was research?" Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You thought threatening to have me fired based on confidential medical records was acceptable behavior?" Tyler slumped in his chair, the weight of his actions finally becoming clear to him. "What's going to happen to me?" "That depends on what the federal investigators find in your electronic devices," Sarah said matter-of-factly. "If you were actively involved in accessing the databases, you could face charges as well. If you were just the beneficiary of your father's crimes, you might escape prosecution." She leaned forward slightly, and Tyler flinched. "But either way, your campaign against me is over. Your father's legal protection is gone. Your access to privileged information is gone. You're just another high school student now, and you'd better hope you can learn to act like one." Tyler left the health office a broken young man, his swagger replaced by the hunched posture of someone who'd just realized how small and powerless he actually was. Word of his father's arrest spread through the school within hours, and by the end of the day, Tyler's social position had collapsed as completely as his father's legal career. Mason and Ethan distanced themselves immediately, claiming they'd never been comfortable with Tyler's methods. The other students who'd followed Tyler out of fear or admiration suddenly found him irrelevant. Teachers who'd been intimidated by his father's influence began treating him like any other student. Principal Walsh called Sarah into her office. That afternoon, her manner significantly more respectful than it had been during their previous meeting. "Sarah, I want to apologize for not taking your concerns about Tyler Brooks more seriously. I had no idea his father was involved in anything illegal." "You couldn't have known," Sarah replied diplomatically. "Some situations require resources beyond what school administrators typically have access to. Is there anything the district can do to support you through this situation?" "Just ensure that Tyler understands the new boundaries," Sarah said. "He's lost his protection, but he's still a minor who deserves a chance to learn from his mistakes." Over the following weeks, a new equilibrium established itself at Oakwood High School. Tyler, stripped of his father's protection and social status, became a quiet, unremarkable student who avoided eye contact with Sarah whenever their paths crossed. Mason and Ethan, faced with the reality that their actions had serious consequences, joined the school's community service program and began making amends for their previous behavior. The story of Tyler's downfall became legend throughout the school, though the details became increasingly exaggerated with each telling. Students whispered about the quiet school nurse who'd somehow managed to have the untouchable Tyler Brooks' father arrested by federal agents. The truth was simultaneously simpler and more complex than the rumors suggested. Sarah had simply done what she'd been trained to do: identify threats, gather intelligence, and eliminate problems using appropriate resources. The skills that had kept her alive in Afghanistan translated perfectly to dealing with civilian adversaries who relied on intimidation rather than genuine strength. A month after Tyler's father's arrest, Sarah received a visit from Jessica Park, the student who'd been in the health office during one of Tyler's harassment sessions. Jessica had been one of Tyler's frequent targets, and Sarah had often treated her for stress-related symptoms. "Mrs. Mitchell, Jessica said quietly. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. I know you probably can't talk about it, but everyone knows you're the reason Tyler stopped bothering people." "I just did my job," Sarah replied. "No, you did more than that. You showed us that bullies aren't untouchable, even when they have powerful parents. You showed us that sometimes the quiet people are the strongest ones." As spring turned to summer and the school year wound down, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned during her confrontation with Tyler Brooks. She'd come to Millbrook seeking peace and anonymity, hoping to leave her military identity behind. Instead, she discovered that the skills and experiences that had made her an exceptional soldier were equally valuable in civilian life. The key wasn't abandoning her military training, but learning when and how to apply it appropriately. Tyler had pushed her into a corner where civilian solutions were inadequate, and she'd responded with the full force of her professional network and strategic thinking. The result had been swift, decisive, and proportional to the threat. Sarah kept the framed photo of her old unit on her desk now, no longer hiding her military service but not flaunting it either. She'd found a way to honor both her past and her present, to be both Staff Sergeant Mitchell and Mrs. Mitchell as circumstances required. The health office at Oakwood High School remained her sanctuary, but it was no longer a refuge from her military identity. It was a place where all of her skills and experiences could be used to protect and serve, whether that meant treating scraped knees or neutralizing threats to the school community. Tyler Brooks had taught her an important lesson, though not the one he'd intended. Some battles couldn't be avoided, but they could be won decisively by someone with the right training, resources, and determination. The quiet school nurse had always been a decorated combat veteran. Tyler's mistake had been forcing her to prove it. As the final bell rang on the last day of school, Sarah smiled as she watched students stream towards summer vacation. Next year would bring new challenges and new students, but she was ready for whatever came her way. After all, she'd survived combat in Afghanistan and defeated a teenage bully with federal law enforcement connections. How hard could the next school year possibly be? The story of the school nurse who'd taken down the untouchable bully would be told and retold for years to come, becoming part of Oakwood High School's folklore. But for Sarah Mitchell, it was simply another successful mission completed, another threat neutralized. Another day's work for someone who'd never really stopped being a soldier. 3 months after Tyler's world collapsed, Sarah Mitchell stood in the faculty parking lot of Oakwood High School, watching the sunset paint the Pennsylvania sky in shades of amber and crimson. The school grounds were quiet now, with only a few summer maintenance workers finishing their duties before heading home. The peace that had initially drawn her to this suburban district had finally returned, but it felt different now. Earned, rather than given. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the immediate aftermath of the federal investigation, the school had buzzed with rumors and speculation. Students whispered in hallways about the mysterious forces that had brought down the seemingly untouchable Tyler Brooks. Teachers who had suffered under his father's legal intimidation began to speak more freely, sharing stories of harassment and threats they'd endured in silence. Sarah had become something of a legend among the faculty, though she'd done everything possible to discourage the attention. Coach Thompson had tried to buy her drinks at the local teacher hangout, claiming she'd done what he'd wanted to do for years. Mrs. Patterson from the English department had actually hugged her in the hallway, whispering thanks for getting rid of the boy who'd made her life miserable for 2 years. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. Dr. Amanda Foster, the district health coordinator who supervised Sarah's work, had requested a private meeting. 2 weeks after the arrests, Sarah had expected questions about the incident, possibly even concerns about her methods. Instead, Dr. Foster had closed her office door and spoken with unusual directness. Sarah, I want you to know that what you did took remarkable courage and skill. I've been working in school health for 15 years, and I've seen too many good people driven away by situations they couldn't handle through normal channels. I just used the resources available to me, Sarah had replied modestly. Exactly. You recognized when the system was inadequate and found alternative solutions. That's not something they teach in nursing school, but it's exactly what we needed. Dr. Foster had then offered Sarah a promotion to lead nurse for the entire district, a position that would involve training other school health professionals in crisis management and threat assessment. Sarah had accepted, understanding that her unique background could help other educators who might face similar challenges. The summer months had given Sarah time to reflect on how dramatically her life had changed. What had started as an attempt to escape her military identity had evolved into a deeper understanding of how those experiences could serve her civilian mission. She'd begun conducting workshops for school staff on recognizing and responding to systematic harassment, drawing on principles from military intelligence and threat assessment. The workshops had proven surprisingly popular, attracting educators from across the state who were dealing with similar problems. Sarah had discovered that Tyler's pattern of behavior wasn't unique. Across Pennsylvania and beyond, privileged students were using their families' resources to terrorize school personnel, confident that their connections would protect them from consequences. Sarah's training sessions focused on documentation, escalation procedures, and resource networking. She taught teachers and administrators how to recognize the difference between typical teenage misbehavior and systematic campaigns of harassment. More importantly, she showed them how to build cases that would stand up to legal and political pressure. The federal investigation into Tyler's father had revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond one small-town lawyer. Mr. Brooks had been part of a larger conspiracy involving defense contractors, military database administrators, and local officials who traded favors and information for mutual benefit. The arrests had rippled outward, eventually reaching officials in 3 states and resulting in a major restructuring of military information security protocols. Tyler himself had ultimately avoided criminal charges due to his age and limited direct involvement in the database access. However, the social and educational consequences had been severe. His family's legal troubles had forced them to sell their house and move to a different state, where Tyler would finish his senior year at a public school without the protection of his father's reputation. Before leaving Millbrook, Tyler had made one final visit to Sarah's office. The arrogant, threatening teenager had been replaced by a young man who seemed to have aged years in just a few months. He'd knocked politely and waited for permission to enter, a courtesy he'd never shown before. "Mrs. Mitchell," he'd said quietly, "I wanted to apologize before we moved away. Not because my lawyer told me to, but because I need to say it." Sarah had gestured for him to sit, noting how different he looked without his designer clothes and confident swagger. "I appreciate that, Tyler. I don't think I understood what I was doing," he'd continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought it was just games, just pushing buttons to see what would happen. I didn't realize I was actually hurting people. Do you understand now?" Tyler had nodded slowly. "My dad's in federal prison. We lost our house. I had to watch my mom cry every night for weeks, and that's just what happened to us. I keep thinking about Mrs. Chen and Coach Williams and all the other people we drove away." The conversation had lasted nearly an hour, with Tyler gradually opening up about the pressure he'd felt to maintain his social status and the way his father had encouraged his aggressive behavior. Sarah had listened with the same clinical attention she'd given to wounded soldiers, recognizing trauma and confusion beneath Tyler's words. "What are you going to do differently?" she'd asked finally. "I don't know yet," Tyler had admitted. but I want to figure out how to be better, how to use whatever advantages I have to help people instead of hurting them. Sarah had given him contact information for counselors who specialized in helping young people redirect aggressive behaviors. She'd also provided him with literature about restorative justice programs that might help him make amends to his previous victims. As Tyler had prepared to leave, he'd paused at the door. "Mrs. Mitchell, can I ask you something? When you were in the military, did you ever have to hurt people?" The question had caught Sarah off guard with its directness and maturity. "Yes," she'd answered honestly. "Sometimes that was necessary to protect others." "How do you live with that?" Sarah had considered her response carefully. "By making sure that everything I do afterward serves to protect and heal rather than harm. By understanding that strength should be used to defend those who can't defend themselves." Tyler had nodded solemnly. "I think I understand. Thank you for not destroying me when you could have." That conversation had stayed with Sarah throughout the summer, reminding her that even the most problematic people were capable of growth and change. Tyler's transformation hadn't erased the damage he'd caused, but it suggested that consequences could lead to genuine learning rather than just punishment. The new school year had brought fresh challenges and opportunities. Sarah's expanded role meant working with schools across the district, but she'd maintained her base at Oakwood High. The student body included several new faces, transfers from other districts who'd heard about the school's improved culture and safety measures. Among the new students was Marcus Rivera, a quiet sophomore whose family had moved to Millbrook specifically because of the district's reputation for handling bullying effectively. Marcus had been severely harassed at his previous school, and his parents had researched districts with strong anti-harassment policies before choosing Oakwood. Sarah had met with Marcus during orientation, noting the wariness in his eyes that reminded her of her own first days at the school. "Mrs. Mitchell," Marcus had asked, "is it true that you got rid of some bullies here?" "The school community dealt with a harassment situation," Sarah had replied carefully. "What's important is that every student here has the right to feel safe and supported. My old school said that too, but nothing ever changed." Sarah had leaned forward slightly, speaking with the quiet authority that students had learned to trust. "Marcus, if anyone makes you feel unsafe or unwelcome here, you tell me immediately. Not next week, not when it gets worse. Immediately. Do you understand?" Marcus had nodded, and Sarah had seen some of the tension leave his shoulders. Over the following weeks, she'd checked in with him regularly, noting his gradual integration into the school community. He'd joined the chess club and made friends with several students who'd also been Tyler's former targets. The chess club itself had become something of a symbol of the school's transformation. Led by Mrs. Patterson, it had grown from 3 members to over 20, including several students who'd never shown interest in the game before. They'd explained to Sarah that chess represented strategic thinking and patient planning, qualities they'd learned to value after watching how she'd handled Tyler. Sarah had started attending their matches, partly to support the students, and partly because she'd discovered a genuine appreciation for the game's tactical complexity. The skills that had served her in military intelligence translated surprisingly well to chess strategy, and she'd begun incorporating game theory into her threat assessment workshops. The workshops themselves had evolved into a comprehensive program that attracted participants from across the region. School administrators, counselors, and security professionals came to learn Sarah's methods for identifying and neutralizing systematic harassment. The program had caught the attention of the State Education Department, which was considering making it a mandatory training for all district leadership. Sarah had also begun working with law enforcement agencies to develop protocols for handling cases where school harassment crossed into criminal territory. Her military contacts had proven invaluable in these collaborations, bringing expertise in intelligence gathering and threat assessment that most civilian agencies lacked. The most rewarding aspect of her expanded role, however, was the direct impact on individual students and staff members. Teachers who'd attended her workshops reported feeling more confident in their ability to handle difficult situations. Students who'd been harassment targets found support through the programs she'd developed. One particularly meaningful success story involved Jennifer Walsh, a junior who'd been systematically harassed by a group of students through social media and anonymous messages. Using techniques Sarah had taught the counseling staff, they'd been able to trace the harassment back to its sources and build a case that resulted in both school discipline and legal consequences for the perpetrators. Jennifer's parents had requested a meeting with Sarah to express their gratitude. "Our daughter was becoming a different person," Mrs. Walsh had said through tears. "Withdrawn, anxious, afraid to go to school. What you taught this district saved her." These victories, large and small, had helped Sarah understand that her confrontation with Tyler had been about more than just defending herself. It had been about establishing principles and procedures that would protect future victims of harassment. Tyler's defeat had sent a message throughout the district that systematic bullying would not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's family connections. The message had apparently spread beyond Oakwood High as well. Sarah had received calls from educators in other states asking for advice on handling similar situations. Some had faced harassment from students with powerful parents. Others were dealing with systematic campaigns by groups of privileged teenagers who believed themselves untouchable. Sarah's advice was always the same. Document everything, build networks of support, understand your legal options, and never hesitate to escalate when civilian channels prove inadequate. She'd also begun maintaining a database of resources and contacts that could assist educators facing similar challenges. As autumn arrived and the one-year anniversary of Tyler's arrest approached, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had changed. The quiet school nurse who'd hoped to blend into suburban anonymity had become a recognized expert in educational threat assessment and harassment prevention. Her military background, once something she'd tried to hide, had become the foundation for a new career helping others. The transformation hadn't been without costs. Sarah's PTSD symptoms had actually intensified during the confrontation with Tyler, requiring her to resume counseling and adjust her medication. The stress of the federal investigation and subsequent media attention had taken a toll on her mental health that she was still working to address. But the benefits had far outweighed the difficulties. Sarah had found a way to serve others that drew on all of her skills and experiences. More importantly, she discovered that her military identity and civilian life didn't have to be separate compartments. They could be integrated into something stronger and more effective than either would have been alone. The health office at Oakwood High remained Sarah's primary workspace, but it looked different now. The walls displayed not just health education posters, but also certificates from her training programs and thank you notes from students and staff across the district. The photo of her military unit sat prominently on her desk, no longer hidden, but celebrated as part of her professional identity. On quiet afternoons, Sarah would sometimes look at that photo and think about her old teammates, wondering if they'd found ways to use their military skills in civilian life as successfully as she had. Tank had visited over the summer, expressing amazement at what Sarah had built from her confrontation with a teenage bully. "You know," Tank had said as they'd walked through the school hallways, "I think this might be the most important mission you've ever completed. You're not just helping individual kids. You're changing how entire systems respond to threats." Sarah had appreciated the recognition from someone who understood the military mindset. But she'd also come to realize that her civilian colleagues' acknowledgement meant just as much. Dr. Foster's respect, Principal Walsh's gratitude, and the students' trust represented acceptance into a community that valued her contributions, regardless of their origins. As the final bell rang on another successful day, Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to head home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. A workshop for regional superintendents in the morning, a consultation with state education officials in the afternoon, and the routine health duties that remained the foundation of her work. But tonight, Sarah would have dinner with Mrs. Chen, the former librarian who'd returned to Oakwood High after Tyler's departure. They'd become close friends over the past year, bonded by their shared experience of surviving systematic harassment and emerging stronger. Mrs. Chen had often said that Sarah's courage in confronting Tyler had inspired her own decision to fight back rather than simply accepting victimization. The drive home took Sarah through the peaceful streets of Millbrook, past the tree-lined neighborhoods that had originally attracted her to this community. The town looked the same as it had when she'd first arrived, but Sarah's understanding of it had deepened considerably. She'd learned that even in safe suburban communities, predators existed and victims needed protection. More importantly, she'd discovered that the skills she'd developed as a combat medic translated perfectly to civilian service. The same instincts that had helped her save lives under fire now helped her protect students and staff from different kinds of threats. The strategic thinking that had made her an effective soldier now made her an exceptional educator and advocate. As Sarah pulled into her apartment complex, she reflected on the lessons learned over the past year. Strength could be quiet, and patience could be powerful. Sometimes the most effective response to aggression was careful planning rather than immediate retaliation. But when action became necessary, decisive intervention could prevent far more damage than gradual escalation. Tyler Brooks had taught her these lessons by forcing her to apply them, though certainly not in the way he'd intended. His attempt to humiliate and drive away a vulnerable school nurse had instead awakened a decorated combat veteran who'd turned his own weapons against him. The irony was poetic, but the real victory was in the systems and protections Sarah had built to prevent future Tylers from succeeding. That evening, as Sarah prepared for bed in her peaceful apartment, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from meaningful work well done. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve and protect, to use her unique combination of medical training and military experience to make her community safer and stronger. The quiet school nurse had indeed been a combat veteran all along. Tyler's mistake had been forcing her to prove it, but his defeat had created something far more valuable than personal vindication. It had established principles and procedures that would protect countless future victims from the kind of systematic harassment that privileged predators had once conducted with impunity. Sarah Mitchell had found her true calling, not in hiding from her military past, but in using it to build a better civilian future. The mission continued, but now she had an entire community of allies helping her complete it. 2 years after becoming a legend at Oakwood High School, Sarah Mitchell found herself facing an entirely different kind of challenge. The Pennsylvania Department of Education had assigned her to Riverside Academy, an elite private boarding school, where traditional disciplinary methods had failed spectacularly. The Academy's board of directors was desperate enough to hire a former combat medic turned school nurse, despite her unconventional background. Riverside Academy occupied a sprawling campus in the wealthy suburbs of Philadelphia, its Gothic architecture and manicured grounds designed to project an image of old money prestige and academic excellence. The school catered to the children of politicians, corporate executives, and international diplomats, charging tuition fees that exceeded the annual salaries of most Americans. For generations, Riverside had been the launching pad for future leaders, sending its graduates to Ivy League universities and positions of power. But beneath the polished veneer, something had gone terribly wrong. Over the past 3 years, the academy had lost 12 faculty members to stress-related resignations. Student disciplinary incidents had increased by 300%. Most troubling of all, 3 separate investigations by Child Protective Services had been launched following allegations of systematic abuse, though no charges had ever been filed. Dr. Margaret Thornton, the Academy's headmistress, had briefed Sarah during her initial interview with barely concealed desperation. "We need someone who can handle situations that go beyond normal educational challenges," she'd explained. "Our students come from families with significant resources and influence. Traditional authority structures don't seem to apply here." Sarah had accepted the position partly because of the substantial salary increase, but primarily because the challenge intrigued her. After successfully transforming the culture at Oakwood High, she was curious to see how her methods would work in an environment where the power dynamics were even more complex. Her first day at Riverside Academy had been an education in elite privilege, unlike anything she'd experienced. Students arrived in chauffeur-driven luxury cars, carrying designer backpacks that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The dormitory facilities resembled 5-star hotels, more than school housing, complete with private bathrooms, high-end furniture, and concierge services. But Sarah's trained eye had immediately noticed troubling signs beneath the luxury. Students moved through the halls with a peculiar combination of arrogance and wariness, like young predators, constantly assessing threats and opportunities. Faculty members kept their eyes down when certain students passed, exhibiting the kind of submissive body language Sarah had seen in civilians living under hostile occupation. The medical facility at Riverside Academy was state-of-the-art, equipped with diagnostic equipment that many hospitals would envy. Sarah's predecessor had left detailed notes about frequent accidents involving specific students, patterns of injuries that suggested systematic intimidation rather than normal teenage mishaps. The documentation painted a picture of an institution where violence had become normalized, hidden behind the academy's prestigious reputation. Sarah's military instincts had gone on high alert within hours of arriving at Riverside. This wasn't just a school with discipline problems. It was a contained environment where a small group of students had essentially taken control through intimidation and violence. The faculty and administration had become complicit through fear, allowing the situation to deteriorate beyond the point where normal interventions could be effective. The source of the problem became clear during Sarah's first week, when she encountered the group that faculty members referred to in whispers as the Circle, led by 17-year-old Victoria Ashford, daughter of a federal judge and granddaughter of a former Secretary of State. The Circle represented the absolute pinnacle of Riverside's social hierarchy. Victoria was everything Tyler Brooks had aspired to be, but multiplied by wealth and connections that extended to the highest levels of government. Tall, elegant, and possessed of the kind of natural charisma that drew others into her orbit, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd never faced genuine consequences for her actions. Her followers included Marcus Kellaway, whose father owned a media empire, Elena Vasquez, daughter of a pharmaceutical company CEO, and James Morrison, son of a tech billionaire. Unlike Tyler's crude attempts at intimidation, the Circle operated with sophisticated psychological manipulation that bordered on sociopathic. They'd perfected the art of destroying their targets while maintaining plausible deniability, using their family's resources to cover their tracks and intimidate potential witnesses. Sarah's first direct encounter with Victoria had occurred during what should have been a routine medical examination. Victoria had arrived at the health center claiming to have injured her wrist during a tennis match. But something about her demeanor had immediately put Sarah on alert. "You must be the famous Mrs. Mitchell," Victoria had said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We've heard so much about your reputation. Quite impressive, dealing with those public school bullies." The casual dismissal of Tyler Brooks as a public school bully had been deliberately insulting, designed to establish Victoria's superiority over both Sarah and her previous adversaries. It was also a clear signal that Victoria had researched Sarah's background and was prepared for conflict. "Let me take a look at that wrist," Sarah had replied professionally, ignoring the provocation. As Sarah had examined the supposedly injured wrist, Victoria had continued her psychological probing. "I imagine working here must be quite an adjustment after that little suburban school. The students here come from a different caliber of family, people with real influence, not just local. Lawyers and small-town connections." The examination had revealed no evidence of injury, which Sarah had noted in her records. "Your wrist appears to be fine. You can return to class." "Oh, I think I'll rest here for a while," Victoria had said, settling into a chair with the air of someone claiming territory. "It's so interesting to meet someone with your background. Military service must have been challenging for someone from your social class." The calculated nature of the insult had been impressive in its sophistication. Victoria was attempting to establish dominance through class-based intimidation, while simultaneously probing for emotional reactions she could exploit. It was psychological warfare, conducted with the precision that only came from extensive practice. Sarah had recognized the tactics immediately. During her deployments, she'd encountered enemy interrogators who used similar techniques to break down prisoners. The goal was to establish psychological superiority by attacking the target's sense of self-worth and social position. "Victoria," Sarah had said calmly, "you're going to return to class now. If you actually injure yourself in the future, I'll be happy to provide medical attention." Something in Sarah's tone had penetrated Victoria's confidence, suggesting depths that the teenager hadn't expected to encounter. For just a moment, Victoria's mask had slipped, revealing the calculating intelligence beneath her privileged facade. "Of course, Mrs. Mitchell," Victoria had replied smoothly. "I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." Over the following weeks, Sarah had documented a pattern of behavior that made Tyler Brooks's harassment campaign look amateurish by comparison. The circle didn't just target individual victims, they systematically destroyed anyone who challenged their authority through coordinated psychological and social warfare. Their most recent target had been Dr. Elena Vasquez, a young Spanish teacher who'd made the mistake of giving Victoria a failing grade on a major assignment. Within days of the grade being posted, Dr. Vasquez had found herself subjected to a campaign of harassment that was both subtle and devastating. Anonymous complaints had been filed, with the administration claiming that Dr. Vasquez was discriminating against American students in favor of international ones. Her personal belongings had been vandalized in ways that couldn't be proven but were clearly deliberate. Most damaging of all, the circle had somehow obtained and distributed compromising photos from Dr. Vasquez's social media accounts, doctored to suggest inappropriate relationships with students. The sophistication of the attack had been breathtaking. Every move had been calculated to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. When Dr. Vasquez had tried to fight back, she'd found herself facing legal threats from multiple family attorneys and administrative pressure to resign quietly rather than face a prolonged investigation. Sarah had watched Dr. Vasquez's destruction with growing anger, recognizing the same tactics she'd seen used against dissidents and resistance fighters in war zones. The circle wasn't just bullying individual teachers. They were conducting psychological operations designed to maintain control through fear and intimidation. The breaking point had come when the Circle had targeted Maria Santos, a scholarship student whose presence at Riverside Academy represented everything Victoria's group despised. Maria was brilliant, hard-working, and came from a working-class family that had sacrificed everything to give their daughter opportunities they'd never had. Sarah had first met Maria when the girl had come to the health center suffering from severe anxiety attacks. The 16-year-old had been trying to hide the extent of her distress, claiming she was just having trouble adjusting to the academic pressure at Riverside. But Sarah's trained eye had recognized the signs of someone under systematic psychological assault. Maria's symptoms weren't academic stress. They were the result of sustained psychological warfare conducted by experts in manipulation and intimidation. "Maria," Sarah had said gently, "I need you to tell me what's really happening. You're not having panic attacks because of homework." The story that emerged had been both heartbreaking and infuriating. The Circle had targeted Maria from her first day at Riverside, viewing her scholarship status as an affront to their exclusive social order. They'd begun with subtle social exclusion, ensuring that Maria was isolated from potential friends and support networks. When social isolation hadn't been enough to drive Maria away, the Circle had escalated to direct psychological attacks. They'd spread rumors about her family's financial situation, created fake social media accounts to post humiliating content about her, and systematically sabotaged her academic work through various means. Most insidiously, they'd convinced other students that associating with Maria could result in similar treatment, effectively turning the entire student body into accomplices through fear. Maria had found herself completely alone in an environment designed to break down her confidence and force her to leave. "Why haven't you reported this to the administration?" Sarah had asked. Maria's laugh had been bitter and exhausted. "Mrs. Mitchell, Victoria's grandmother was on the Supreme Court. Elena's father donates millions to political campaigns. Marcus's family owns half the media outlets in the state. Who's going to believe a scholarship kid from Newark?" The resignation in Maria's voice had reminded Sarah of civilians she'd encountered in war zones, people who'd learned that resistance was futile and survival required accepting abuse. It was a mindset that Sarah had spent years fighting against, first as a soldier and then as an educator. "Maria," Sarah had said with quiet intensity, "I'm going to ask you to trust me. Can you do that?" Over the following days, Sarah had begun gathering intelligence on the Circle with the same methodical thoroughness she'd once applied to enemy combatants. She documented their patterns of behavior, identified their resources and connections, and most importantly, she'd begun looking for weaknesses in their seemingly impenetrable armor of privilege and protection. What she'd discovered had been both fascinating and disturbing. The Circle operated like a criminal organization, with sophisticated command structures, intelligence networks, and enforcement mechanisms. They maintained detailed files on potential targets, coordinated their attacks through encrypted communications, and had established relationships with corrupt officials who helped cover their tracks. But they also had vulnerabilities that their privilege had blinded them to. Their confidence in their immunity from consequences had made them careless about evidence. Their belief in their superiority had led them to underestimate opponents who didn't fit their preconceptions. Most importantly, their success had depended on facing adversaries who were constrained by normal social and institutional limitations. Sarah Mitchell was not constrained by normal limitations. She was a decorated combat veteran with resources and connections that extended far beyond anything the Circle had encountered. More importantly, she'd spent years learning how to fight enemies who seemed untouchable until someone with the right skills and determination decided to touch them. Victoria Ashford and her circle were about to learn that some prey fights back with weapons they couldn't imagine. The question wasn't whether Sarah could handle a group of privileged teenagers. The question was whether they were prepared for the consequences of threatening someone under her protection. The war for control of Riverside Academy was about to begin, and the circle had just made their fatal mistake. They'd targeted Maria Santos, a student under Sarah Mitchell's care. In doing so, they'd awakened something that would destroy their carefully constructed empire of fear and intimidation. Sarah had faced down armed insurgents in the mountains of Afghanistan. A group of spoiled rich kids with daddy's lawyers wasn't going to intimidate her, but this time she wouldn't be fighting alone. Maria Santos deserved justice, and Sarah Mitchell had never failed to deliver it when it mattered most. Sarah's investigation into the circle's operations had revealed a level of sophistication that bordered on professional-grade psychological warfare. Unlike Tyler Brooks' amateur attempts at intimidation, Victoria Ashford's group operated with the precision of a military intelligence unit, complete with detailed target profiles, strategic planning sessions, and coordinated execution of multi-phase campaigns. The discovery had come through Maria Santos, who'd reluctantly agreed to help Sarah gather evidence after weeks of careful relationship building. Maria had provided Sarah with screenshots of encrypted group chats, recordings of circle meetings conducted in unused dormitory rooms, and most damning of all, access to a shared digital folder containing what the circle called their subject files. Each file represented a meticulously documented psychological profile of students and faculty members who'd crossed the circle's path. The profiles included family financial information, personal vulnerabilities, social media analysis, and detailed attack strategies tailored to each target's specific weaknesses. Dr. Vasquez's file alone contained over 50 pages of intelligence, including private medical information that should have been impossible for students to access. Sarah had reviewed the files with the same clinical detachment she'd once applied to enemy intelligence briefings, but the scope of the circle's operations had genuinely shocked her. These weren't spoiled teenagers acting out. They were conducting sophisticated psychological operations that would have impressed military intelligence officers. Victoria Ashford's personal file had been particularly revealing. Unlike Tyler Brooks, whose aggression had stemmed from insecurity and need for validation, Victoria's motivations were far more complex and disturbing. She genuinely believed that her family's position in society gave her the right to control and manipulate others, viewing people as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated. The file contained correspondence with private investigators, legal consultants, and even a former CIA officer who'd apparently provided training in interrogation and psychological manipulation techniques. Victoria's family had essentially weaponized their connections to create a monster who could destroy lives with the casual efficiency of a professional operative. But the most disturbing discovery had been the circle's long-term strategic planning. They weren't just targeting individual students and teachers, they were systematically identifying and eliminating anyone who might challenge their control over Riverside Academy's social and academic environment. Their ultimate goal appeared to be creating a completely controlled environment where they could operate without any oversight or opposition. Sarah had seen similar strategies employed by insurgent groups seeking to establish territorial control in contested regions. The parallels were exact. Identify key influencers, eliminate opposition through targeted campaigns, establish fear-based compliance among the general population, and corrupt institutional authorities through intimidation or compromise. The realization that she was facing an enemy with genuine strategic sophistication had forced Sarah to reconsider her approach. This wouldn't be a simple matter of exposing bad behavior and letting institutional authorities handle the consequences. The Circle had already demonstrated their ability to manipulate and corrupt those authorities, turning them into accomplices rather than opponents. Sarah's first step had been to establish secure communications with Maria and identify other potential allies who might be willing to resist the Circle's control. This had proven more challenging than expected, as the Circle's reign of terror had created an atmosphere of pervasive fear that extended throughout the entire school community. Most students were too terrified to speak openly about the Circle's activities, having witnessed the systematic destruction of previous targets. Faculty members who might have been willing to help were either compromised through blackmail or intimidated into silence through legal threats. Even the maintenance and support staff had learned to avoid any actions that might draw the Circle's attention. However, Sarah's military training had taught her to identify potential resistance networks even in heavily controlled environments. She'd begun establishing contact with students and staff members who showed signs of resilience and independence, carefully building relationships that could support more active resistance when the time came. One unexpected ally had emerged in the form of Dr. James Crawford, the Academy's elderly librarian who'd somehow managed to survive multiple Circle campaigns against faculty members. Unlike other staff members who'd been broken by the Circle's attacks, Dr. Crawford had maintained his dignity and independence through what appeared to be sheer stubbornness and institutional knowledge. During a carefully arranged private meeting in the library's rare books section, Dr. Crawford had revealed that he'd been documenting the Circle's activities for over 2 years, maintaining detailed records of their campaigns against students and staff. His files provided crucial historical context that filled gaps in Sarah's understanding of their operational methods. They've destroyed 17 faculty members and driven away at least 30 students, Dr. Crawford had explained, his voice carrying the weight of years of frustration. Each time, the administration has chosen to accommodate them rather than confront them. The board of directors is too concerned about maintaining relationships with the Circle's families to take effective action. What about external oversight? Sarah had asked. State education authorities? Accreditation boards? Dr. Crawford's bitter laugh had told her everything she needed to know. Victoria's grandmother sits on the State Board of Education. Marcus's father owns the company that handles the Academy's public relations. Elena's family has donated millions to various educational organizations. They've systematically corrupted every potential source of external oversight. The conversation had confirmed Sarah's growing suspicion that conventional approaches would be inadequate for dealing with the Circle. Their network of family connections and institutional corruption had created a protective barrier that normal disciplinary procedures couldn't penetrate. But Sarah had faced similar challenges in Afghanistan, where enemy networks had often enjoyed protection from corrupt local officials and complicated political relationships. The solution had always been to identify vulnerabilities that the enemy's protective network couldn't cover, then exploit those weaknesses with surgical precision. The breakthrough had come when Sarah had discovered the Circle's most closely guarded secret. Their operation extended far beyond Riverside Academy. Victoria and her associates were part of a larger network of privileged teenagers from elite schools across the East Coast who shared intelligence, resources, and tactical knowledge for their respective campaigns of intimidation and control. The network operated through encrypted forums hosted on dark web servers, using cryptocurrency transactions to fund their activities and maintain operational security that rivaled professional intelligence organizations. They'd essentially created a shadow network of teenage sociopaths with unlimited resources and no effective oversight. More importantly, the network had been infiltrating other institutions beyond private schools. Several members had gained positions in youth political organizations, elite summer programs, and preparatory courses for Ivy League admissions. They were systematically positioning themselves to carry their methods into adult institutions, potentially creating a generation of leaders trained in psychological manipulation and social control. The scope of the conspiracy had been staggering, but it had also revealed vulnerabilities that Sarah could exploit. The network's reliance on digital communications created opportunities for electronic surveillance. Their financial transactions left trails that could be traced by someone with appropriate resources. Most importantly, their confidence in their security had made them careless about operational details. Sarah had begun reaching out to her military contacts, particularly those working in counterintelligence and cybersecurity fields. The network's activities potentially constituted domestic terrorism or conspiracy charges under federal law, especially given their use of interstate communications and financial systems to coordinate criminal activities. Colonel Hayes had been particularly interested when Sarah had briefed her on the Circle's operations. "What you're describing sounds like a domestic intelligence threat," she'd said, after reviewing Sarah's documentation. "If these kids are really operating at this level of sophistication, they represent a potential national security concern." "Can you help?" Sarah had asked. "I can put you in touch with the right people, but Sarah, if you're right about the scope of this network, you're not just fighting a group of spoiled rich kids. You're taking on families with genuine political power and intelligence community connections." The warning had been sobering, but not unexpected. Sarah had already realized that the Circle's capabilities suggested adult involvement and training that went far beyond what teenagers could develop independently. Someone with professional intelligence or military experience was providing them with guidance and resources. The confirmation had come through an unexpected source. James Morrison, Victoria's lieutenant and the son of tech billionaire Robert Morrison. Unlike the other Circle members, James had shown signs of psychological instability that suggested he might be vulnerable to the right kind of pressure. Sarah had arranged to encounter James during one of his frequent visits to the health center for various psychosomatic complaints. Over several sessions, she'd carefully probed his psychological state while providing legitimate medical care for his anxiety and insomnia. What she'd discovered had been both useful and disturbing. James was suffering from severe guilt and fear related to the Circle's activities, particularly their recent campaign against Maria Santos. He'd been having nightmares about potential consequences and had begun questioning whether their actions might have legal ramifications. More importantly, James had revealed that the Circle's operations were overseen by a group of adult consultants who provided strategic guidance and resource coordination. These consultants included former intelligence officers, military contractors, and corporate security specialists who'd been hired by Circle families to provide their children with life skills training. The training had gradually evolved from legitimate leadership development into something far more sinister, as the consultants had recognized the potential for creating a network of operatives embedded within elite social and educational institutions. The teenagers had become pawns in a larger game involving corporate espionage, political intelligence gathering, and social control experiments. Sarah's military experience had given her insight into how such networks developed and operated, but it had also shown her how they could be dismantled. The key was identifying the network's most vulnerable points and applying pressure in ways that forced the entire structure to collapse. The Circle's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness, their reliance on family connections and institutional protection. Those same connections created exposure points that could be exploited by someone with the right knowledge and resources. More importantly, their confidence in their immunity had made them careless about operational security in ways that professional operatives would never tolerate. Sarah had begun developing a comprehensive campaign designed to simultaneously expose the Circle's criminal activities, document their adult oversight network, and provide irrefutable evidence to federal authorities who could act without regard for local political considerations. The plan would require careful coordination with her military contacts, systematic documentation of federal crimes, and strategic timing to prevent the Circle from destroying evidence or intimidating witnesses. Most importantly, it would require protecting Maria Santos and other potential victims, while building the case that would bring down the entire network. Victoria Ashford and her Circle had made the same mistake as every other enemy Sarah had faced. They'd underestimated her capabilities and overestimated their own immunity. They were about to learn that some battles couldn't be won through privilege and political connections alone. Sarah Mitchell had faced down professional terrorists and survived multiple combat deployments. A network of spoiled rich kids with delusions of grandeur wasn't going to intimidate her, regardless of how sophisticated their operations appeared to be. The war for Riverside Academy was about to begin, and the Circle had just made the fatal error of threatening someone under her protection. The difference between this campaign and her previous confrontation with Tyler Brooks was that this time, Sarah wouldn't be fighting alone. She had federal resources, military support networks, and most importantly, a growing group of allies within Riverside Academy who were ready to resist the Circle's reign of terror. Victoria Ashford was about to discover that her carefully constructed empire of fear and intimidation could be brought down by someone who understood warfare better than she understood manipulation. The Circle's days of immunity were numbered, and their adult supervisors were about to face consequences they'd never anticipated. Sarah had always been a soldier first and a school nurse second. The Circle had just reminded her which identity took precedence when students under her care were threatened. The response would be swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating to anyone who'd chosen to stand against her. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.